What's up guys, Justin here with the RenderingEssentials.com, back with another V-Ray beginner tutorial for you. So in this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know as a beginner to start using V-Ray to create renderings. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. So this video is going to teach you the fundamentals of working with V-Ray. So everything you need to know to get started. If you stick around to the end, we'll talk a little bit about how to set up your lighting and other things to create more realistic renderings as well. So make sure you stick around for that, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, so note that this video is being made in Vray version 5. The fundamentals will stay the same no matter what version you're using, but that's the current version that we're using within Vray. And so when you first install Vray and you enable it, what you're going to notice is you get 4 different menus, right? You get the Vray objects, utilities, lights, and Vray for SketchUp. These are going to be the menus that are going to give you access to the tools that you can use in order to create renderings inside of Vray. For this video, we're going to focus mostly on the Vray for SketchUp window. These other windows do give you different tools, so things like planes, adding grass, other things like that, as well as some other tools having to do with the way that you can place materials and creating artificial lights. But for the most part, for the beginner video, we're going to focus on the Vray for SketchUp window. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close these other windows, and we're going to take a look at what Vray can do. So when you look at this, there's a couple different sections of things that you can access within Vray. So first off is the asset editor. This is where you're going to edit things like materials and lighting, your overall render settings, other things like that. We'll get more into this in a minute, but we're going to spend a lot of time in the asset editor. To the right of that is Chaos Cosmos. So I've talked about this more in depth in another video, which I will link to in the notes down below, but this basically gives you access to the Chaos Cosmos material and model library. So if you are a Vray subscriber, then you get access to all of this for free. So it has a realistic model and material library built in that you can use in order to bring these things into your model. So right here are going to be the buttons that we can press in order to create renderings. So for example, there's a button right here called the render button, which if you click on is basically going to create a 3D rendering of your scene. To the right of that is an interactive render. So what the interactive render is going to do is it's going to pop up a window that's actually going to update with your SketchUp window. So for example, if I orbit in here, you'll see the view change in my render. If I adjust materials or add objects, you'll see that in here as well. So we're not going to talk too much about Chaos Cloud right now. This allows you to export this into a cloud render. And then Vray Vision is the real-time rendering engine built into Vray. So basically what this one does is this allows you to actually move around inside of your scene as if it was like a video game or something like that. So we haven't really set it up, so some of my faces and things look a little bit weird, but notice how you can use the W, A, S, and D keys to move around. You can click and drag your mouse button in order to look in different directions, things like that. I've actually done an in-depth video about that, which I will link to in the notes down below as well. Now there's other options off to the right, so things like doing an interactive render inside of the SketchUp viewport, opening up the frame buffer, which is basically the window that your rendering is created inside of. We're not going to worry too much about that for right now, but that should give you an idea of where everything is. And so now let's take a look at what happens when you create a rendering inside of Vray. So the first thing we want to do is let's just create a simple box. So I'm just going to use the rectangle tool and create a box that I extrude into 3D. And so if we look at this box and then we were to run an interactive render, most of what we do is going to be interactive render for this video. So if we create an interactive render and fly around this, notice how what's happening is this is actually simulating the way that light works within this window. So it's creating a 3D rendering by using lighting and materials to simulate the way something looks. So notice, for example, that if I rotate this way and look at the sky, notice how the sky is brighter over here. So that's where my light source in my scene is. And what the light source does is it generates light inside of your scene that the other objects react to. You might have multiple different kinds of light in a scene. We can talk more about that later. But notice how this side that's on the far side of this box from the light is dark, while this side right here is light. That's because this is reacting to the light inside of the scene. And so let's say that we were to take this box and we're going to make it a group. And then I'm going to create a plane that this box is sitting on. Well now, and we'll go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so that my default model is on it as well. Well now, if we look at this inside of the viewport, notice how this is actually generating the shadows from the objects. So the sun is up here and it's shining down, and notice how my objects inside of my scene are blocking the sun, and V-Ray is generating realistic shadows inside of my scene based on that sun location. And so let's say that we were to go into SketchUp under the shadows function and we were to adjust the time of day. So remember, SketchUp also simulates your shadows. So if I was to turn this on right here, notice how my shadows are in the same place as they are in my rendering. Well, if I was to adjust the time of day inside of SketchUp, notice how my shadows change. So now they're going this way. Well, if I was to go back into my V-Ray frame buffer or my rendering, you can see how the shadows inside of the scene change direction as well. So this is a fundamental thing, is that the sunlight inside of V-Ray is currently linked to the SketchUp sunlight, meaning you can adjust the sun location inside of SketchUp and it's going to adjust inside of V-Ray as well. And so this is kind of the basics of how lighting works inside of V-Ray. We can get more in-depth in the future, but now let's take a look at materials, because if we look at this right now, right, this is pretty boring, right? It's pretty generic. So we've got a box and then a ground plane right here. Well, let's create another model off to the right. We can actually go ahead and leave this on this surface. I'm just going to move this box back and scale it down like this. So we're just going to kind of move it out of the way. And so let's say that we wanted to create another surface. So I'm going to create a circle. I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to tap the control key and pull it up again, and then I'm going to scale this in. So basically what we've done is we've created a kind of pedestal, right? So if we look at this inside of V-Ray, you can see how the pedestal is showing up in here. And we'll go ahead and adjust this so our shadows are a little further out. But I'm going to take this whole object, make it a group like this. I'm also going to make my ground a group. That's just to keep everything from merging. It doesn't really have anything to do with the way V-Ray works, at least at the moment. But now, let's say that we wanted to start adding materials inside of our interactive render. So what we can do is we want to open up the asset editor. The asset editor is going to be the place where you're going to manage all of your different materials inside of SketchUp. And notice how, or inside of V-Ray, notice how right now all of the materials currently inside of the asset editor are listed in here. Well, in addition, if you tap this left arrow key like this, notice how there's also a library of materials built into V-Ray that you can apply to objects. And so let's say, for example, that we wanted this to look like maybe like a polished wood or something like that. So if we were to click on wood and laminate, notice how in here there's a number of different material types in here that are pre-built to interact with lighting the proper way, like this. And so let's say we wanted to apply one of the veneers in here. So for example, maybe this veneer A01. So if I was to right click on that, notice how there's options to add this to my scene or to apply to selection. Add to scene would just add that to this list right here. Apply to selection is actually going to add it to your scene and apply it to this object. So what I want to do is I'm going to click on the option for apply to selection. And so notice what that did is that took this wood material and it applied it to this object right here. And so now, if we were to jump back into our interactive render, notice how this wood material is now showing up inside of V-Ray. And one of the cool things about this is not only is the texture applied to this, like this, but there's also different maps applied to this object that make it look bumpy. So if we look at this really close, notice how this wood material looks bumpy in here. That's due to a map that's been applied to the material. We don't need to worry about that too much in this video, just know that it's there. And then if we were to rotate around, notice how the light is actually now reflecting off of this object right here, like it has a little bit of a sheen. So if I was to take that back within SketchUp, so if I was to go to my materials and just apply a default material right here, notice how the light isn't really bouncing off of this material right here. What it's doing instead is it's just kind of a flat, like matte surface. But if we were to undo that and look at the wood material is actually acting as if a wood material would act inside of the real world. And so you can find more information about that material inside of the V-Ray asset editor as well. So notice how this material now shows up inside of our material list. And if I was to click on it, I can actually click on this little right arrow right here, and this is going to pop up a little window that gives me information about this material. So it gives me a preview as well as other things like the bump map, for example, which is going to affect if a material looks bumpy. So if you click in here, notice how this is blue. It's blue because there's a texture image loaded into that it's using in order to simulate the bumpiness of the material. And so I don't want to get too far into this right now, other than just know that this is where the information for these materials live. And so one thing to note about this is notice how when this gets added to your V-Ray materials, it's also going to show up inside of your in-model SketchUp materials right here. And so if we were to change this to something ridiculously small, just so you can see that it's adjusting, like if we were to bring this down to 1 inch, notice how that texture material gets really small in here and it's over tiling, which we don't want. But if you look at this, notice how it adjusts inside of your interactive render as well. So changes made over here are going to be reflected inside of your rendering. So let's go ahead and let's put this back to close to what it was before, and let's go ahead and keep moving. So in addition to this, right, this is a wood material, but V-Ray is going to simulate a number of other materials as well. All right, and so let's say we added some shapes like this. Let's take a look at some of the materials that you can add inside of V-Ray. So V-Ray lets you do a number of different kinds of materials. So for example, there's a bunch of rough materials in here. So things like brick or concrete, these are built in. Note that you can create your own materials as well. We can talk about that in the future. But let's say that we wanted to do some of the more interesting ones. So for example, the car paint. So what the car paint is going to do is that's going to be a material that's going to basically reflect light the way that car paint would. So let's say we wanted to apply this to our cone right here. Well then, if we were to take a look at this, inside of our scene, notice how it's reflecting light in here, but it's also got some kind of like flaky looks in it, like car paint would. So this simulates the way that car paint would look inside of the real world. So there's also materials like glass. So for example, let's say that we wanted to add maybe like a yellow or orange glass material. So we could just right click on here and apply this to our selection. Well, notice when we do that, if we look at this object, it's actually refracting light through the object. So this is actually simulating the way that light would actually travel through this object when we apply the glass material. So the glass material allows us to do some really realistic things with light inside of our scene. So we've also got things like metals. So let's say we wanted to apply an anodized aluminum to our cube right here. Notice how this is actually going to look like an aluminum material. Notice how this plastic leather material is actually going to make this object look like it's bumpy, like a plastic or a leather material would look. So this is actually being simulated inside of V-Ray, and it looks really realistic. So you can use the materials in order to create different looks inside of your scene. And note that there is a lighting section in here as well that allows you to adjust things having to do with your light. So for example, let's say that we wanted to adjust the brightness of our sunlight in our scene. Well, notice how there's an option in here to adjust our sunlight right now. So if we were to click on our sunlight, notice how there's a little 1 here. We could add numbers to this in order to increase the brightness of our scene. Now you do need to be careful with this because notice how on the left hand side when we do make that change, things start looking kind of washed out. So that's because we have too much light in our scene. Remember that this is simulating lighting inside of our scene. So if we go outside of realistic norms, then you're going to start getting some weird results. So we're going to leave this as is, but if you did have more lights in your scene, this would show those different lights in here and you could edit them using the different settings. But let's say that we wanted to export an image. And so what we want to do real quick is we want to jump into the settings tab. So the settings tab is going to be really important because it's going to allow you to adjust the various settings having to do with your image inside of this tab. So notice how, for example, there's tools in here for things like if you're going to use your CPU or your GPU, right? Your graphics card versus your CPU. So your graphics card is usually going to render faster. And so you can adjust that. Usually you have to turn off the interactive render before you do that. But there's also tools in here for things like your camera. So notice how inside of V-Ray, this is generating an image based on a camera view. So this is basically simulating a camera when it generates this view inside of SketchUp. So it's looking at it with an exposure value, it's looking at it with things like depth of field, which can make some things blurry while other things are clear. This really does act like an actual photographic camera inside of your scene in order to generate your image. And notice how there's an exposure value in here. So let's say I was to go to 14 like this, or let's go to 12 just so it's more visible. Notice how when I change the exposure value, the brightness of my scene gets brighter. So a lot of the time, instead of adding light to your scene, because you want your light to be as realistic as possible, you'll come in here and you'll adjust your exposure value in order to make your view brighter. And then down below, if you want to adjust the size of your rendering right here, there's an option here for render output. So if we were to adjust our image like this. So right now, for example, if we were to export this image, it's going to export it as an 800 by 450. If we wanted this to be a larger image, we could put something like 1280 by 720, something like that. Notice how my interactive render resized to match that. But let's go ahead and let's export our render. So what we want to do is we want to stop our interactive render, which you can do by clicking on this button right here, or if it's running, you can also do it inside of the V-Ray frame buffer. And let's go ahead and let's jump over into the frame buffer for our final image creation. And so now we've been doing an interactive render, right? So we want the interactive render in order to quickly see what's going on inside of our scene. However, for our final render, we want to use the actual render function right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this button right here. And so notice how now, if I was to adjust the size of this rendering that's created, or if I was to adjust the view, notice how this isn't adjusting anymore. So the reason it's not adjusting anymore is because we turned off the interactive mode of the render, and we made this just like an overall render where to update we have to press the button. But if I was to press the button again, it would re-render with the new view. All right, so now let's say we wanted to save this image. We can just go up to File and click on the option for Save Current Channel. In this case, we only have one channel because we haven't added any kind of layers or anything like that to this. So if we click on Save Current Channel, that's going to allow us to save our image. And so in this case, we're just going to call this Render 01. Click on Save. Then if we go into that folder and we open up that image, notice how we have a 1280 by 720 image of the rendering that we created. And so say we wanted to create another rendering. So let's say we wanted another view, maybe like this one right here. Well, we could just adjust this around, go back into V-Ray and click on the button for render. And so that's going to re-render this image with that new view. Well, then we could save that as render 2. And so notice how you can go through and you can quickly save multiple different views of a rendering by changing your view in this way. All right, so that should give you an idea of the fundamentals. Now, real quick, let's take this rendering and let's make it a little bit more realistic. So we're going to speed up a little bit. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide everything in this scene except for these objects right here. And so notice how if you do an interactive render, this doesn't really look very good in the current lighting, right? And the reason it doesn't look very good in the current lighting is because this is currently using the V-Ray sun in order to generate this. What we're going to do is we're going to swap out the V-Ray sun with an artificial light. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to open up that V-Ray lights tab right here. I'm just going to add a rectangle light. And by the way, if you're lost on any of this, don't worry, we'll get into it more in the future. But I want to give you kind of an idea how this might work. So what we've got is we've got this light in here, and I want to rotate the light so that it's facing at my object right here. Maybe at kind of an angle. So we're just going to align this. So it's like we've got a light that's kind of up above, pointing down. And we can go ahead and take a quick look at our interactive render. Notice how that light shows up in our scene and it's bouncing off of these objects, but it's being kind of overshadowed by our sun. So what we want to do is we want to jump into the asset editor right here, and we're just going to click on the little sun right here in order to toggle the sunlight off. Well, now if we jump back into our interactive render, notice how all of our lighting in our scene is now coming from that light right here. And we can adjust the brightness of that light by adjusting this object right here. So for example, if I was to bump this up to 50, and let's go ahead and do this while it's on the screen. So if I was to bump this up to 50, notice how it's a little bit brighter. If I was to bump it up to 100, notice how it's even brighter still. All right, now is I don't like having the gray background, and I don't like that I can see this light. So I'm going to take this rectangle light, and I'm going to go into my options. I'm going to set it so that it's invisible. Basically what that means is that the light will be cast inside of our scene, but you're not actually going to be able to see this right here, right? So you can see the light, but you can't see the actual light object right here. So the other thing I want to do is go to Settings under Environment, and I want to toggle this so that I don't have anything going on in the environment. Just uncheck this box, and then we're just going to have a black color in the background. Well, notice how now inside of the scene we actually have a black background because we toggled off the environment. So you can toggle off that environment in order to get this kind of black view. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another couple lights in this, maybe some like more dim lights real quick. So I'm going to take this light right here, and I am going to create a copy here and a copy here. And so for these two lights, what I want to do is I want to make them unique. So I want to right click on them and make them unique. Well, notice how then these show up as separate objects inside of my scene. And what I want to do is I want to take that backlight and I want to bring it down to maybe like 30. Maybe bring these other two down to like 50. Or we'll go ahead and leave it at 100. And so now if I was to jump back into my interactive render, you can see I'm getting a much more realistic look in here. And one other thing, and this is kind of an attention to detail thing, is the edge around here is way too big, like the bevel is, and it's kind of distracting with the texture materials that are in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump in here real quick, select this face, scale it out, just like this. This looks a little bit better, but then we could just export this the same way that we did before. So that's a very high-level overview of the way you can start creating renderings inside of V-Ray. We're going to continue this series getting more in-depth on materials and lighting and other things like that. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you click that subscribe button so you can catch those future videos. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. If you want to download V-Ray, I have linked to that option on this page as well. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.